Hello and welcome to this sixth session of the online course on human rights in Southeast Asia. This class looks at indigenous and minority rights. Minority groups and indigenous peoples were long excluded from international politics and marginalized within states since the creation of the nation-state system some 4 centuries ago. So why are rights needed for minorities and indigenous groups? Well, indigenous groups face massive violations of their land ownership. Minorities in history have faced persecution. Minorities or indigenous peoples are in all Southeast Asian countries, and each one must try to deal with them equitably, fairly. Southeast Asia is home to about 100 million indigenous peoples and numerous minority groups. Southeast Asia is therefore home to 1/4 of all indigenous peoples in the world. So in looking at indigenous and minority rights in this course, this class, we will proceed as follows. We will look first at the definition of minorities and indigenous peoples. Then we will explain the emergence of international concern for minorities after World War I and their struggle at the United Nations. We will look at the principle of self-determination. We will then identify the human rights concerns for minorities and examine a case study. And finally, we will finish up by looking at the environment and indigenous peoples' rights. Let us start by looking at the definition of minorities and of indigenous peoples. A universally accepted definition has proven difficult. Generally, however, it comprises 2 key components. One is an objective component. Minorities are generally in a numerical inferiority and often, not always, in a non-dominant position. The second is the subjective component. Minorities must show a sense of belonging to a group that seeks to preserve itself through its culture, language, and religious traditions. These components were first identified by Professor Kapotorti in a seminal study in 1977 for the United Nations. They were later included in various instruments, notably the 1992 Declaration on the Rights of Minorities and a subsequent European Convention on the Rights of Minorities. These objective and subjective elements also serve to define indigenous peoples, but in addition, indigenous peoples place particular emphasis on their relationship with land. This aspect was identified and elaborated upon by Mr. Martinez Cobo in a 1981 seminal study on discrimination against indigenous peoples. These elements of the definition of indigenous peoples also found their way into an instrument in 2007, an international instrument called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Let us now turn to the broad historical and political context in which concern for minority and indigenous peoples' rights have arisen. There have, of course, always been minorities throughout history, but they became to represent a problem specifically with the rise of the nation-state, a particular form of state which is a very centralized form of the state in which minorities and indigenous peoples have not fit very well. They have been persecuted, they have been marginalized, and this continues until today, even in very advanced countries in the international system. The first instance of concern for minority rights took place around the time of the establishment of the League of Nations. The League, in fact, contributed to elaborating a series of minority treaties for peoples in parts of Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, Poland, for example. The bad treatment of minorities, bad governance and bad treatment of minorities, it was held, contributed to starting conflicts at the time of World War I and at the time of World War II. So the League of Nations and the leaders at that time sought to provide some protections for minorities, and thus started the international concern for minorities. Minority situations in the post-World War II context also proliferated, specifically discrimination, marginalization, persecution of minorities. The nation-state system proliferated after World War II as new countries emerged out of decolonization. Indigenous peoples in Southeast Asia suffered from the legacy of not only colonialism, but also the creation of these new nation-states. Their lands were taken away. Some groups were not even recognized, and to this day there are still some, or many in fact, stateless groups. Hill tribes, maritime communities, migrant maritime communities, for example, which still have no citizenship and are not recognized formally as part of state entities. So the international concern for minorities and indigenous peoples has paralleled the rise of the nation-state, started about 1 century ago nearly, and continues until today when, for example, if you look at Scotland, if you look at Quebec, and you look at Spain today, minority situations continue to pose a problem for the nation-state, both over there and of course here in Southeast Asia. Next, we will examine 2 issues. Firstly, an overview of indigenous and minority groups in Southeast Asia, and we will look at which Southeast Asian countries have recognized minorities and indigenous rights.
ASEAN is rich in ethnic diversity. Some countries like Myanmar, the Philippines, and Malaysia have about 100 minorities or more. Indonesia, with more than 700 recognized groups, has the most in the region. However, none of these countries have ratified the ILO Convention 169 on Indigenous and Tribal People Convention. At the same time, all the countries have voted in favor of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People that was adopted by the General Assembly in 2007, with 144 votes in favor, 4 votes against, and 11 abstentions.
Let us now turn to the rights of indigenous peoples. What problems, what difficulties do they face? What are they concerned with? They are concerned with land and land ownership. Land on which they say they have been living for centuries, well before the era of colonialism. They're concerned with having economic and social rights, the ability to earn a livelihood from the land. They are concerned with being marginalized. Mountainous or sea gypsies, for example, don't get the same access to basic services. They are concerned with the ability to practice their own culture and religion. They are concerned about discrimination because they lead a different lifestyle. After decades of claiming their rights, in particular at the United Nations, the 2007 Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights afforded to indigenous peoples a number of basic rights. They have the right to their land and to the resources on the land. They have the right to self-determination, and they have the right to take part in decision-making that affects their communities. Let us look now at the rights of minorities under the 1992 Declaration. The latter encompasses a number of key rights. First of all, the equality of minorities with all others in society. Secondly, it encompasses their right to survival and existence. Thirdly, it encompasses the preservation of their identities. And fourthly, it encompasses their right to effective and meaningful participation in society. Minorities have the right to participate effectively in decisions on the national and, where appropriate, regional levels concerning the minority to which they belong or the region in which they live. They have the right to establish and maintain their own association. They have the right to establish and maintain relations with other members of their own group and with other minorities. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights also provides for the right to self-determination. It provides for rights to language, religion, and cultural practice. It provides, for example, for the ability to be taught in one's own language, the ability to practice one's traditional cultural traditions such as weddings, funerals, and cultural events. Southeast Asian minorities face discrimination, repression, and persecution on multiple grounds. Persecution on religious grounds in particular is preoccupying and is unfortunately a feature of contemporary Southeast Asian human rights landscape. One can note the difficulties in Indonesia at the present time. Violations such as not being able to speak one's language or discrimination because of belief are all too frequent across the region. Now let us look at a case study on minority rights in the region.
Most of the indigenous groups in Southeast Asia are relying on their land resources for their land material production for their livelihood. They are facing challenges. Number one is from the capital investment, who needs a lot of land or forest area for the capital investment, but they also get some assistance from the local country or the states, who are usually tend to take sides to the companies. Therefore, the first challenge is that the land are having pressure from both sides, which is the indigenous groups and the states themselves. This is the first challenge. The second challenge is that when this capital investment already arrive in their lands, sometimes they have to lose their land and they have to turn themselves as the laborer for the capital investment, which sometimes makes them a very underpaid laborer in these enterprises.
Finally, let us look at the more recent development of indigenous groups' rights over land and resources. This relates partly to the contemporary issue of the environment. Flowing from self-determination and being part of decision-making in matters that affect them, states must consult and cooperate with indigenous peoples to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before undertaking development activities that might have an impact on them. The World Bank, for example, follows this practice. Prior informed consent and benefit sharing is provided for under the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization. We must also mention complementary work being done in other fora, in particular the World Intellectual Property Organization. The WIPO over the last 16 years or so has been examining the protection of traditional knowledge, of genetic resources, and of folklore of indigenous peoples. This concludes this class on minority and indigenous groups. I hope you have enjoyed the discussion.